God, good afternoon. I'm Doris Wise-Montrose, and I thank you all for coming to our debate about the next president and the Jewish people. The impetus to sponsor this debate came from our awareness that the topic of Israel was not discussed in any meaningful way, if at all, in any of the presidential debates so far. Considering the amount of time, effort, and money that is being spent on the Arab-Israeli conflict by the United States government and the number of trips made to that region by Condoleezza Rice, one would think that Israel would be a major issue for any candidate who desires to be the next president. Modern Israel has been our consistent natural ally since her rebirth in 1948. We share values and commitments. America benefits from a safe and secure Israel. We understand that one does not have to be Jewish or a child of Holocaust survivors to know that Israel truly represents the canary in the coal mine. For these reasons and more, for all of us here today, a strong and secure Israel is in line with a strong and secure America. As Jews, history has taught us that we can only live with integrity anywhere in the world because of the existence of the State of Israel. All other issues pale in comparison. Today we will gain more insight into which candidate is committed to these goals. Our moderator, Goldberg, is Stephen Goldberg. Steve is an attorney who is... It just so happens. Steve is an attorney who is Vice President of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, Los Angeles, and National Vice President of the Zionist Organization of America. Steve will introduce our debaters and will give us today's rules of engagements. Thank you.
I'll not repeat my name since it's been mentioned a few times already. First of all, if you could all shut your cell phones off. First, we are privileged today to have a rising star in the Democratic Party and a rising star in the Republican Party. I'm sure these men sitting with me are going to be people we're going to be hearing about in the coming years. Andrew Lachman, and Andrew, raise your hand, is president of Democrats for Israel, Los Angeles. It's a Democratic club that advocates for the pro-Israel community within the Democratic Party. Andrew also organized the LA chapter of the National Jewish Democratic Council and was co-chair of Los Angeles Jews for Kerry and deputy constituencies director for Pennsylvania Kerry Edwards in 2004. Andrew is West LA lead organizer, was for the 2006 California Democratic Coordinated Campaign for Steve Wesley and deputy director of the Maryland Democratic Coordinated Campaign in 1994. He's an alumnus of the Anti-Defamation League Salve and Leadership Program of Los Angeles Jewish Federation's New Leaders Program. Andrew is a lawyer with a technology consulting company in Woodland Hills. Larry Greenfield, and Larry, raise your hand here, is a California director of the Republican Jewish Coalition, and he oversees 10 growing chapters in California. Larry graduated Georgetown University Law School in Washington, D.C., where he worked on an arrest warrant for Yasser Arafat, which helped deter his appearance before the UN. Larry was in the Armed Forces of the United States and Naval Intelligence, and he frequently lectures on foreign policy. He's traveled to approximately 75 countries, including 9 war zones, and has worked to assist distressed Jewish communities in Ethiopia and Yemen. Larry is statewide co-chair, was statewide co-chair of Governor Schwarzenegger's successful re-election campaign, and was an advisor to the governor's legal office during the clemency appeal of Stanley Tukey Williams. Here are the rules. And I'm hoping to make this candid, lively, interested, and get as many questions in as we can. I'm going to have each one will give an opening statement. And the question that I'd like them to address, and they should be approximately 5 minutes each, is why should Jewish Americans be supportive of your party in this coming election? Each of you should have had index cards with pencils so you could write questions. They should have been on your chairs. If any of you have not done so, Doris has some in the back and there are some up there, and there will be people collecting them. I will be gathering these questions. I'll be sifting through them to make sure that each side gets the appropriate number of questions and that all necessary topics are covered. The person to whom the question is directed will have an opportunity to answer it. The other person will get to comment, and then the first person will get approximately 30 seconds to a minute to do a quick rebuttal if he wants. While that's being done, I guess first, then at the end there'll be closing statements, and again I'll try to cover as many questions as I can. Let's start, I guess, with the opening statements, and I'm going to start with Larry Greenfield.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Steve and Andrew. And thank you very much, Doris, for organizing this conversation. Today is Veterans Day, and I thought I'd begin by paying tribute to those who have served. I see a few who might have been part of the greatest generation. Thank you for all who've served at home and abroad in our wars. 16 million Americans served in World War II. 600,000 of them were American Jewish heroes. By the way, the American Jews who served in World War II were given an option not to have the Hebrew, the letter H, on their dog tags lest they be caught behind enemy lines and sent to a concentration camp. Most decided to keep the H on their dog tags. We also pay tribute today to those on active duty, serving in dozens of countries around the world in the global war on terror, especially those in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, Operation Iraqi Freedom in Iraq. I think it's nice to recognize, as friends of the IDF, our brothers and sisters in Israel also doing battle on a front line in the war on terror, and those who are caught behind enemy lines, Ron Arad, Goldwasser, Regev, and Shalit. Our political liberties and this political conversation are the result of men and women of resolve who liberate and serve, defend, and protect. Many are heroes. On my mind today is Lieutenant Michael Murphy, just recently and posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He was a Navy SEAL. Politics used to end at the water's edge. Today it remains critical that Jewish citizens across party lines work together on such projects as divestment from Sudan and Iran, energy independence and diversification to wean ourselves off foreign oil, and strong support of the Jewish state of Israel under attack from both jihad abroad and, I would say, left-wing academics and activists in Europe and America. Patriotism should not wear a party label, and reasonable disagreement about the issues is consistent with Jewish notions of honest and honorable debate. Unfortunately, and my thesis is that the long tradition of bipartisanship in foreign policy in the United States has now collapsed in the face of the hijacking of the Democratic Party by the anti-war left, and therefore the 2008 national elections present significant foreign policy distinctions for Jewish voters to weigh. First, I note the disturbing views of national Democratic leaders regarding our military fighting radical Islamists around the globe. Senator Kerry, for example, has repeatedly smeared our troops as uneducated losers. This canard ignores the fact that our military volunteers have higher than average educational backgrounds, re-enlist in large numbers, and many even plead to remain in the Iraqi theater when they're tested for possible brain damage due to blasts or IEDs or bombs. Senator Durbin notoriously compared our troops to Nazis, Stalinists, and the Khmer Rouge. Senator Obama claimed that we are air raiding villages. Congressman Murtha slandered our best and brightest by falsely prejudging a difficult incident at Haditha as a purposeful massacre. Congressman Stark, a few weeks ago, claimed the commander-in-chief enjoyed for entertainment value sending young warriors into battle. He later apologized, but the sentiment was shocking. And finally, Congressman Clyburn revealed what's in the hearts and minds of many Democrats by stating that American success in Iraq would be bad for the Democratic Party. Operation Iraqi Freedom merits honest discussion and debate. But Senate Majority Leader Reid claimed earlier this year that the United States had already lost while our troops were in battle, and in fact had liberated Iraq, ousted Saddam and his sons in the Ba'athist regime, won every military battle they've engaged in, and increasingly successfully helped Iraq stand up, reduce civilian casualties, and in Al-Anbar province, reject al-Qaeda in the Sunni area. In his recent address last week, The Politics of National Security, 2000 Democrat vice presidential nominee and now independent Senator Joseph Lieberman lamented the collapse of democratic foreign policy tradition of Roosevelt, Truman, and JFK. And he said that Democrats are now more invested in defeating the Bush administration than in preventing Iraqi genocide due to rapid withdrawal of forces from the Iraqi theater, or in defeating terrorists like those of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Council. He was, of course, formally referring to the Kyle Lieberman Amendment, which declared the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Council, a terrorist entity. He was also referring to the Webb Amendment in the Senate. Senator Webb sought to limit the president's options to confront Iran and its nuclear proliferation. Mr. Webb is a possible Democratic vice presidential nominee and not a friend of the pro-Israel community. Mrs. Clinton seconded the Webb Amendment and broke ranks with the pro-Israel community, which does not want to tie the hands of our commander-in-chief regarding the Iranian threat. In sum, my thesis is that the Democratic Party has been hijacked by the far left. Many Democrats no longer support our troops or their victory. A majority of Democrats no longer comfortably and clearly support Israel, the Jewish state, unambiguously as our moral and strategic ally. This is not our parents' and grandparents' Democratic Party.
Thank you, Larry. Andrew, now your turn.
Thank you very much. I'll pull this forward a little bit here so that everyone can hear me. I'd like to thank Children of Jewish Holocaust survivors. I do know that in my own family, recently one of my cousins, Jerry Gerard, age 90, passed away. He got out of Germany in 1932, leaving behind a law degree that he could not use, but dedicated the rest of his life in the United States to helping reunite families that had been separated by the Holocaust, and using his ability to speak German also to translate documents to make sure that the horror was properly documented so it should never happen again. I'd also like to thank Stephen and, of course, Larry. We've done this a couple times in a couple places in the past. And I forgot to mention, usually when you hear about the Georgetown versus GW rivalry, it was because Ken Starr went to GW Law School and Bill Clinton went to Georgetown undergrad. Well, he went to Georgetown Law School, I went to George Washington University Law School, so the rivalry still lives. But this is a very appropriate topic for discussion, as my parents actually are in Israel for the first time this week. They're in their 60s and feel that things have gotten to the point where they feel safe to go to Israel. It was always a big concern for them, and they are enjoying every moment of it. They've called me 3 or 4 times asking what little gift they can get from myself or my fiance in Israel, because they have some of the most wonderful wonderful art objects there and that sort of thing. I want to just ask a couple quick questions to the audience. A quick show of hands. How many people here consider yourself political conservatives? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people here consider yourself to be political, we'll use the other, progressives or liberals? Okay. There are about 15 to 20 in here, but that's okay. Different organizations have different viewpoints. I bet if I was in front of a group like ADL, there might be a slightly different makeup here than here. That being said, how many people here feel that the peace process that's going forward in Annapolis is a waste of time and we shouldn't be moving forward with it? Raise your hand. Okay. The bad news I have for you is with regards to 2008, you're going to be very disappointed, because neither party has any candidate that echoes those positions. We have conservatives, we have liberals, we have ultra-progressives, and we have ultra-conservatives. But but we have an opportunity here with the deeply fractured country to try to come together and to try to make sure we stand behind our ally Israel, and to make sure that we try to find ways of addressing, as has been put forward, the Islamofascist, the jihadist, however you want to put it, threat that is before us. But what I am here to put to you today is that when it comes to standing up for Israel, and when it comes to standing up to these threats which face not only Israel but the United States, the Democratic Party has been one that has been consistent in word and action, whereas the Republican Party has said the right things to you, but when they've actually done things, they haven't always done what's been best for Israel, or necessarily for Jews in this country, or necessarily identifying the real jihadist threat. And the real jihadist threat comes from East Pakistan and comes from Iran, not Iraq, and from Saudi Arabia, I would add. But if you look at where the previous administration put its resources and how it spent the goodwill and resources, Israel is now less safe than it has ever been. It is more isolated than it has ever been. And also, the United States has put its agenda and pushing Israel around. Some of you may feel that with the Annapolis conference as well. That's one example. I will give you a couple of quick examples as well. Since Larry was very good to point out all of my party's flaws, I can point them out on the other side. First of all, currently, this organization was key in supporting AB 221, which allows the state teachers and the state employees pension fund to withdraw money, to divest from companies doing business with Iran's oil industry. The problem is right now that there's federal enabling legislation that's currently stuck in the Senate. It's being sponsored by Barack Obama on the House side, and I believe Tom Lantos it was by Barney Frank on the House side and by Barack Obama on the Senate side. Currently, the Bush administration and Richard Shelby, a Republican from Alabama, have put a hold on this legislation so as to render AB 221 useless until this bill is passed, because there are prohibitions on certain kinds of divestments, and would also require the State Department to create a list of which companies we're supposed to divest from. When it comes time for standing up to the churches who have chosen to divest from Israel, the Democratic Party alone passed a resolution saying that they were opposed. And it was Patrick Murphy, an Iraq war veteran from Pennsylvania, who put up a piece of legislation condemning the British academic boycott of Israel. This boycott has been going on for 3 to 4 years. The Republican Party has done nothing with regards to discouraging divestment, but it took Patrick Murphy to stand up and to push for this. And I believe in the last 2 weeks, the UTU has announced that they are abandoning their boycott of Israel academics. There are other examples. In 2003 and 2004, the Republican Congress cut aid to Israel twice. Not economic aid. There was a deal about cutting economic aid. This was military aid cuts. At the same time, while increasing aid to the Saudis. It was because of a combination of Democratic Congress members and a small group of Republican Congress members who actually managed to stop the attempts by the Republican leadership to increase aid to Saudi Arabia. Aid, including military hardware, which could eventually be used against the Israelis. Even more recently, there have been attempts by the most recent foreign aid bill that was passed, which expanded military aid to Israel by another $200 million, was opposed by the Republican leadership. Now, I want to be very clear about this. They've said they opposed this because there was another item in the bill which would repeal a ban on contraceptive and family planning aid to third world countries and non-government organizations. The difference is, and this is Howard Berman pointed this out to us, for many years Democratic Congress members have voted for bills containing aid to Israel that contained other things they didn't like because they felt aid to Israel was the most important thing. Yet the Republican leadership took this unusual step of opposing a foreign aid bill expanding aid to Israel because of the repeal of the Mexico City Declaration. It doesn't mean that Republicans are more anti-Israel. I would point out, and as Larry has pointed out, that we've got problems on both sides. We've got pro-Israel people on both sides. But it does bring into question, where are their Republicans' priorities? If they're willing to put the agenda of the religious right and their feelings about contraceptives to third world countries ahead of aid to Israel, do they really have the best interest of Israel in mind? I would also add that it was Senator Kerry who sponsored the Syria Sanctions Enabling Act, and it is this administration that has took over 2 years to finally enforce it after pressure from a Democratic Congress. With regards to President Ahmadinejad's comments about wiping Israel off the map, although it was said back in 2005, early 2006, it wasn't until 2007 that a Democratic Congress put forth a resolution calling for Ahmadinejad to be referred to the United Nations Security Council for war crimes for incitement to genocide. Twice as many Republicans voted against it as Democrats. To put it in perspective, and this is important, 4 Republicans, 2 Democrats voted against it. But that's also important for another reason. Both sides have their issues, and I find it very disingenuous to take statements out of context about the war in Iraq or specific statements about how it's being conducted as being interpreted as being A, anti-troops, or B, being anti-Israel. For every Dennis Kucinich and for every Cynthia McKinney that's been out there, there is a Ray LaHood, there is a Ron Paul, and there is a Darrell Issa. And for those of you who may forget, Darrell Issa and I actually got to square off in the Jewish Journal a little bit because I brought up the point that he told the Fox News that Hezbollah does some very good things. Okay? There are lots of Republicans on the other side who are constantly who are anti-Israel. But they get brushed over much more than Democrats. And unlike the Republicans, when we have anti-Israel Democrats like Cynthia McKinney, we vote them out of office. I will point out one last thing before we get into the discussion back and forth. And that has to do with the discussion about these wars going on in Iraq, and with regards to what's happening in Afghanistan. It is okay to say you disagree with the mission put forward and you can still support your troops. And to say that because you oppose a poorly conceived war that distracted us from the real threat, which was Iran, and in fact, as a result of the Iraq war, Iran is now more powerful than it has ever been because we eliminated their 2 biggest competitors. Namely Iraq and also parts of the Taliban. It's just different. It is erroneous to say that that means you don't support your troops. Patrick Murphy, an Iraq War veteran, and again I mention him because he's a good friend of mine, certainly supports our troops. John Murtha, although he may have been mistaken, he's willing to say when he's mistaken. When's the last time you've heard a Republican say, I made a mistake on anything? But it is better to have made those mistakes and move forward than it is to never look back and never admit a single error. I'm still waiting for Rudy Giuliani to talk more about the mistakes he made with Bernie Kerik, and hopefully we'll get the chance to talk about that as well. But it is important that with what little goodwill we have left in the world, that we find a way of restoring that goodwill, because that is how we're going to check the jihadist threat and how we're going to support Israel is by continuing to support them in the mainstream. Bill Clinton, in some ways, and he made some mistakes with regards to Yasser Arafat, did more to stabilize Israel's economy and brought more trade to Israel and more relationships to Israel with China, with Russia, even with countries such as Jordan and Egypt than this administration has ever done to help the country of Israel in the last 7 years under this administration. They talk a good game, but Democrats have always been there from the beginning. Thank you.
All right. I have some audience questions, but first I'm going to have them each ask a question of each other. And I'm going to ask Larry to ask if you have a question for Andrew.
Sure. So there was some confusion about Hillary Clinton's statement the other night. The New York governor has proposed giving driver's licenses to illegal aliens. What is her position on illegal immigration and driver's licenses generally?
I'll answer this in 2 parts. First of all, she actually admitted that wasn't her best night, which I think it's nice to have someone say they had good nights and bad nights. From what I understand about Hillary Clinton's positions with regards to illegal driver's licenses, it is my understanding that she does not support it, although this is more of a state issue. But there is a Real ID Act in place which requires that, whether legal or illegal, there are certain restrictions and requirements to make sure that we keep track and that people who are coming into this country are not able to commit acts of fraud as what occurred to bring about 9/11. With regards to immigration as a whole, most Democrats advocate a strong enforcement. They've been supportive of strengthening border enforcement and also of increasing Homeland Security budgets as well. I would point out that the 9/11 Commission recommendations came out 6 years ago, and the Republican Congress never enacted the 9/11 recommendations. It was a Democratic Congress that finally did that, including with Senator Hillary Clinton as part of that group. And also, I would say, also point out that this administration has still refused to invest in inspecting our containers and trying to make sure that we've got the border security we need so that people are not just walking across in the middle of the desert, et cetera.
So on the issue of illegal immigration, I think most of us support and adore the ideal of immigration, but very much oppose its being illegal. I did want to clarify the Senator's record. I wasn't clear on her statement the other night on Governor Spitzer's plan, but her record on immigration is, in March of 2002, Senator Clinton co-sponsored a bill to extend the deadlines by which illegal aliens living in the U.S. would be required to obtain a visa. In October of 2003, she favored granting temporary protected status to illegal Haitian immigrants. In September of 2004, she co-sponsored an agricultural jobs bill offering illegal farm workers a speedy path to citizenship. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, she co-signed a September 2005 letter asking Homeland Security Secretary Chertoff to prevent the deportation of any illegal aliens whose immigration status had become clear after they sought federal assistance. You mentioned that you support the Real ID Act. Well, in 2005, Senator Clinton opposed the Real ID Act, which stipulated that all driver's licenses and photo ID applicants must be able to verify that they are legal residents of the United States. It also contained provisions to prevent terrorists from abusing asylum laws and to streamline the deportation of immigrants convicted of terrorism-related offenses. She opposed the Real ID Act. In June of 2007, Mrs. Clinton voted against a bill that would have prohibited illegal aliens convicted of serious crimes from gaining legal status. That same month, she voted in favor of the Immigration Reform Act of 2007, which would have provided a path of legalization to all illegal aliens residing in the U.S. Again, we're still waiting for a clear answer on whether she supports or opposes driver's licenses to illegal aliens in New York.
Very brief reply, then.
Sure. There are other problems and other things mentioned in the Real ID Act that I don't have time to go into. If the position here is that we want to somehow ship back 11 million people that are in this country illegally, I think it would eat up our entire Homeland Security budget. And almost every Democratic candidate has made clear that there needs to be a balance between holding people accountable here, making sure that they follow the law, and that people here who are here, have good jobs and have an employment history, versus those who just seem to mysteriously think that we can just snap our fingers and 11 million people were gone. That's not going to happen. I can also very simply tell you from dealing with anyone who deals with regards to this particular community that some of these people who are in some ways have come here, whether seeking asylum or otherwise, turn out to be some of our best citizens. I would even point out that my fiancé, who was born in Guatemala, came here fleeing political prosecution, and because of some problems originally was in the country illegally for a very short period, but managed to get their paperwork in order. It's just ridiculous for the xenophobic approach that you're seeing in the Republican Party put forward.
That's good.
We have to be able to, we have, it's just not, okay, it's a xenophobic approach. I understand the difference between illegal, you're not going to be able to get rid of 11 million people overnight. It's not going to happen.
All right, so
Sure.
no. Now, Andrew, you have a question for Larry.
Certainly. This organization worked very hard to pass AB 221, yet it is President Bush and Richard Shelby who is holding up the enactment of the legislation on the federal level. How do you justify, one hand calling for action against Iran, but the other hand taking away our ability to put forth all of the best tools of diplomatic and sanctions that we could use in order to resolve this problem?
So I'm very happy that AB 221 passed unanimously in the Assembly. It was sponsored by our friend, Republican Assemblyman Joel Anderson from San Diego. A lot of us worked with him. It was signed by our Republican governor. And it's great that we work together across party lines on Sudan and Iran divestment. The President has proposed increasing sanctions, many of which Democrats have opposed. The President supported the Kyle Lieberman amendment. Many Democrats opposed. That's the amendment which would give the President the authorization to consider the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist state. It was the Democrats, the Webb Amendment, which wants to limit the President's actions regarding Iran. The President subcontracted out diplomatic efforts and sanctions efforts to the British, the French, and the Germans. They're supposed to be the experts in international diplomacy. They're the Europeans who know how to discuss with everybody. Didn't get very far. Iran is definitely a revolutionary regime, which is emboldened by the irritation of the world with them. Iran wants to have a nuclear weapon for many reasons, for the status of its regime, as an umbrella to create a Shia revival in the Middle East, to intimidate. You talked about in your opening statement the failures of Iraq. One of the successes of Iraq, and there are many, besides stopping the checks of $25,000, which went to the families of homicide bombers blowing up Jewish children in Israel by Saddam Hussein, was that we now actually have, with our 140,000 troops in Iraq, a buffer against Iranian hegemony in the Middle East. So it happens to be, this is an area where we seek bipartisanship, which is divestment from Iran. The Republicans have a pretty good record on confronting and divesting from Iran.
That's funny because the bill is still held up in Senate on the hold per the request of President Bush, probably because he doesn't like to stand up to the oil industry, which is who would be affected by this. I would also point out that at the same time, companies such as Halliburton continue to do business with the Iranian government, and we have yet to hold them accountable either. So it is one thing to say you oppose what is happening with Iran, but then you don't give them all the tools. It's very different. It's, again, the action is not meeting up with the rhetoric.
You get the quick report.
Okay.
No, okay. All right, then I've got, first audience question, and it's directed to Andrew. Why do the Democratic candidates for president seem to be reluctant to use the term Islamofascism? Don't they realize that Islamic fascists are the enemies of both Israel and the U.S., or are they simply being politically correct?
I think part of it has to do with the fact that there's been efforts by neoconservatives to control the language in this country. And I'll give you a couple of examples in other areas. Changing the estate tax to the death tax. There are examples in terms of being, quote, with regards to the immigration debate is another example. There is a very strong record on the Democratic side in terms of standing up to these particular groups, such as Al Qaeda, the mullahs in Iran, the Taliban, etc. And as a matter of fact, even more consistency. I don't know if you saw this morning's news, but Pakistan, our best ally in the world, just entered into an agreement with Iran to share natural gas. Where has been the United States? Where has this administration been in standing up and making sure that Pakistan is consistent on its policy with regards to taking on Al Qaeda in its own country? But that being said, this is a question of terminology. And when you speak with different groups, there are different terms you use, and they don't feel comfortable letting the Republicans control the debate with these particular words. It doesn't mean that they're not for better homeland security. As I mentioned, this Congress has been much better on Homeland Security than any of the previous Congresses. Same with standing up to Iran, standing up to Syria, etc. But because Democrats believe in being an inclusive as opposed to a divisive approach, they don't like to use the divisive Republican words. Again, this is the same thing we talked about from the very beginning. Words are one thing, actions are another. Democratic actions speak much louder.
So the question was about the rhetoric and labeling the enemy radical Islam or Islamofascism. So let me give you some examples of Republican position statements. Mike Huckabee, former Arkansas governor: "We value life, and it's what separates us from the Islamic jihadists who are out to kill us." Former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani: "The Democrats couldn't even utter the word Islamic terrorism. It's our biggest enemy. They can't utter the term." And in fact, there have been 9 or 10 Democratic debates. I've not heard neither the words radical Islam or jihad, nor a discussion, a serious discussion about it. Because ultimately, the only people who can finally defeat these radical Islamic jihadists are the Muslims themselves. Governor Romney's statement. "It's a global war. Islamic fanaticism has declared it upon us." Former Tennessee Senator Fred Thompson. "I understand and appreciate the enormity of the challenge we face from radical Islamic extremism." Arizona Senator John McCain. I am surprised at 2 things that you said in your last answer. The first was the use of the term neoconservative, which is, of course, a pejorative now from the left and many anti-Semites and anti-Zionists on all the liberal blogs. I would recommend and request that much care is given to the use of the label as an epithet, neoconservative, because I'd say probably a huge chunk of people in this room are neoconservatives. Secondly, you talked about Democrats confronting Syria and Iran. Well, no. Speaker Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, went to Syria. Now, she did 2 things that were really, really not good. The first was she made up and misrepresented Israel's position regarding the Golan Heights, compromising Israel's strategic security. So much so that the Prime Minister of Israel rebuked her. Now, when she came back, a lot of Jewish Democratic congressmen went all over the Jewish press in America and tried to spin the story, and the Republicans set her up. No, this was her sentiment. She called him His Excellency, and what was the second big problem, besides really messing up Israeli-Syrian relations and basically saying Israel's happy to give up the Golan Heights? Syrian women, reformers, and dissidents cried out and claimed that they were left in the lurch after Mrs. Pelosi's trip, and that when Democrats, and Kucinich, by the way, followed her trip, Congressman Lantos unfortunately went. He's been given a hard time for it as well. Some Republicans have gone to Syria, by the way, including Darrell Issa, who you mentioned, but always with State Department approval, and have never violated the policies and positions of the United States, and never as Speaker of the House, and never, as Tom Lantos indicated, there's a new day in Washington and a new Democratic foreign policy. No, we have one foreign policy at a time in this country. Similarly, regarding Iran, when Edwards and Obama and others make the statement that they'll be happy to negotiate and discuss with terrorists and dictators and tyrants around the world, that leaves in the lurch. It's a very tough moment for the reformers and the students and others on the streets of Iran who are looking for a signal from the United States that we are not going to have peace talks and negotiations with Ahmadinejad. The President of the United States needs to have, as part of his foreign policy, the ability to pick and choose who he's going to dignify with negotiations with the Commander-in-Chief of the United States and the leader of the free world, and who he's not going to talk to. The Democrats may have their own foreign policy, but it's not good for Israel, and it's not good for liberty.
You know, I wish we heard this much from the Republicans when Helen Delitzsch-Bentley was meeting with the Serbians during the Yugoslavian conflict, but obviously it's selectively applied. Henry Waxman, when he came back, and he was on that delegation trip to Syria, came back and spoke in front of Democrats for Israel and presented a very different picture of what happened versus what you've heard here today. And in which he explained that there had been discussions back and forth, and that there was some sort of interest. There had been interest from the Israelis in talking with the Syrians. If any of you read any of the Israeli newspapers as much as I do, there are frequent headlines and discussions back and forth that Israel wants to talk with Syria and has wanted to talk to Syria for some time about the Golan Heights. But it has been this administration that has held threats of withholding housing guarantees if they dare talk to Syria. George Bush has at times put the agenda of Washington ahead of the agenda of Israel. Now, if there's nothing there between Syria and Israel, and there may not be, then that's between the Israelis and the Syrians. But to have our president dictate to the Prime Minister of Israel that he cannot talk, and then, as I understand it, and then also tried to interfere with American policy as well. For those of you who remember when Ehud Olmert came to speak in front of AIPAC, the administration asked them to talk about Iraq, not about the threats to Israel. It's very inappropriate. You know, for years, and I'm going to use the term these group of neoconservatives, because when I was growing up and when my father was growing up supporting Barry Goldwater back in 1964, being a conservative meant you were fiscally conservative and you were careful about how and where you threw your might around the world. These neoconservatives seem to have lost touch with that. The people who are some of the leading neoconservatives, Potthurst and Daniel Pipes, they come from a long line of scholars. Both of their parents were very involved in fighting the Russians and the Soviets, and they believed in using proxies to fight the Russians in various places, in the Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and in these other places. However, what you're seeing now for the neoconservatives, an attempt to, through the bullying of Olmert, is an attempt to basically use Israel as a proxy against these countries, instead of letting Israel, if they want to find peace with their neighbors, that's a decision for Israel to make, not for George Bush and, at the time, Paul Wolfowitz to make.
To Larry, why hasn't the Republican Jewish Coalition and the present candidates for president publicly criticized Condoleezza Rice and President Bush for pressuring Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians and for putting so much emphasis on a Palestinian state? Is it true that among the Republican candidates, the only candidate who has unconditionally come out against the Palestinian state under all circumstances is Duncan Hunter, who is running very low? And do you support what the administration is doing with regard to Annapolis?
So luckily for me, I cut my bones in opposition to elements of the Oslo process when Arafat would say one thing in Arabic and another thing in English. And there's a long track record of Republicans who are very concerned about the Clinton administration. You talk about pressure or cajoling or negotiating with Arafat, who was the guest of Bill and Hillary Clinton 23 times at the White House. This president rejected all of that. He rejected having the godfather of terrorism come to the White House. The president made it clear that he does support a two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians under certain conditions. That's the roadmap. And the roadmap called for the Palestinians to end the incitement and the training of their kids to hate. It called for opposition to terrorism, and it called for an end to terrorism. And what we saw after the 2000 Camp David meeting, when the Israelis offered 97% of the West Bank and parts of Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state, and Arafat turned away and said no, the best offer they were ever going to get, that's when the American, I think bipartisan consensus came to be, there is no Palestinian partner for peace. Some of us thought so long earlier, but many of us certainly believed it after Camp David. The president exchanged letters with the Israelis and said, there are now facts on the ground and we will not pressure Israel to go back to the 49 armistice lines or the pre-67 or post-67 lines. That has been the president's foreign policy regarding the Palestinian state. Frankly, you're trying to come from the right, but usually Democrats come from the left. Oh, they complain, the Americans haven't been engaged enough in pushing the Palestinians and the Israelis into peace efforts. Now, to the part about Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney, and others who've talked about a Palestinian state, because this is the rebuttal to a statement you made in your opening, which is that all the Republicans are in favor of the Annapolis Conference. Rudy Giuliani, in his Foreign Affairs article, Toward a Realistic Peace, suggested that immediate negotiations for Palestinian-Israeli peace were not in the interests.
I got to suggest an emergence. Whoever has a Toyota Tercel white with a 4SH is going about to be towed.
I'm not familiar with that question. Can you give me?
Yeah, sorry.
Luckily, nobody got up.
Right.
Good. In his Foreign Affairs article, Mayor Giuliani said, the Palestinian people need decent governance first as a prerequisite to statehood. Too much emphasis has been placed on brokering negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, negotiations that bring up the same issues again and again. It is not in the interests of the United States, at a time when it is being threatened by Islamic terrorists, to assist in the creation of yet another state that will support terrorism. Final thought, because I believe it deserves an honest answer. As regarding the Palestinians and the Annapolis Conference, since I laid out for you the ideology and the statements and the record of the President in support of Israel and his confrontation of anti-Semitism, some people here have been in the room when the President gets on the phone, yells at Arab leaders or European leaders, tries to knock heads and tell people to cool it on the Israel bashing. I believe what's going on regarding Annapolis is the attempt to create a Gulf state alliance to confront the Shias in Iran. The President is getting phone calls from the, quote, moderate Arab regimes. He got the phone calls from Tony Blair, who he promised he would send as the envoy, the international envoy, to try to make progress in the Arab-Israeli dispute. The President has now downgraded the conference in Annapolis. He's not going to pressure the Israelis. He said that he'll stand by Israel in all of its negotiations. The Israelis will have to make up their mind. A better phrasing of the question would be, to Ehud Olmert, what does he have in mind? If the President had said to Olmert, I don't want our State Department to get involved in brokering discussions between Fatah and Abbas, as opposed to Hamas in Gaza, then we would have heard the argument again from the left. Why isn't the administration supporting Israel in its efforts to have negotiations? Israel does this regularly. Every prime minister, from Bibi and Shamir to Rabin and Barak and Olmert, wants to have conversations with the Palestinians. I'm very comfortable. I trust the President. Annapolis has been downgraded, and I think it has to do with creating an alliance and a conversation for these states as they all seek to together oppose Iran.
The Democratic and the Republican Party platforms both support a two-state solution. I would also point out in all of this that everyone made clear that originally that it should be up to the Israelis. And Ehud Olmert got up and said, I said I would not negotiate for peace unless I felt I have a partner for peace. And I feel I have a partner for peace in Mahmoud Abbas. This is a decision for the Israeli people to make. And in the meanwhile, we should do everything we can to support to support the Israeli government in what it's doing, and that means being consistent in that support. The Bush administration originally was opposed to the security fence, and then very suddenly they became for it. Only 2 presidents have ever filed complaints in the United Nations about human rights violations by the Israelis: Richard Nixon and George W. Bush. Over and over again, you hear the rhetoric on one side and the actions don't match up. This is yet another example. When they'll stand by Israel when it furthers their agenda, but when it comes time of doing what's best for Israel at the Israelis' request, they're never there.
I don't know why you'd say they're never there. The United States just increased its foreign military sales to Israel to $30 billion, so it would keep its qualitative military edge. While we're building this alliance with the moderate Arab states, including arms sales, yes, to Saudi Arabia, which you mentioned in your opening. First, we checked the arms sales with the Israelis who signed off on it, including for the JDAMs, which is the special missile. And when we have the relationship with the Saudis, who are going to buy their weapons from somewhere, because guess what? They're afraid of the Iranians. It's better that we have the relationship military to military. But since we were selling arms to an Arab state, the Saudis, the Americans increased dramatically the arms sales to Israel. Nobody claims from the Democratic side of the aisle that I've ever heard that the United States alliance with Israel isn't strategic and moral and hasn't been wildly supported by Republicans. This would be a good moment to summarize and say, poll after poll comes out between the parties at the grassroots level. Do you support the state of Israel? 84% is usually the number, 84 to 90%. Republicans support the Jewish state. That number has now fallen below 50% among Democratic activists. And so we have a clear difference between the parties on support of Israel. There are and have been good Democrats who support Israel, but for instance, when one of them runs for re-election for Senate, it's the left and the anti-Israel, which is now strong enough in the Democratic Party, to defeat him. Joe Lieberman, hero of the Democratic Party, hero of Jewish Democrats, is now the hero of Jewish Republicans, and still a few Jewish centrist Democrats.
To Andrew, isn't it a sign of disrespect for Jewish voters that the Democratic Party continues to honor Jimmy Carter, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and others who are anti-Israel? What will it say to Jewish voters when such people are honored at next year's Democratic convention?
Well, let me say two things. As soon as the Republicans stop honoring folks like Ron Paul, stop honoring Darrell Issa, Dana Rohrabacher, and Ray LaHood, who used to be one of the chairs of the Intelligence Committee, we can talk about this. It is a fallacy to say that the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is controlled by anti or pro-Israel elements. And I brought up what I said before. The Democratic Party alone passed a resolution opposing divestiture from Israel. Republicans have been silent on this issue. Now, look, Jimmy Carter has been a sore disappointment to many of us, but also including the leadership of the Democratic Party. When Jimmy Carter came out with his book, Nancy Pelosi, Howard Dean, Harry Reid all came out with statements condemning Jimmy Carter and the premise of his book for what he was saying. I don't hear the Republicans doing the same when you have Ann Coulter saying she wants to perfect all of us.
Larry. Okay. All right, Larry, yeah. Larry.
So,
Larry.
Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, who lost Iran in 1979. There was a moment when the army said, we will take over, you've kicked out the Shah, we will have stability in Iran. And Jimmy Carter and Andrew Young, who called him a prince, said, no, we want Khomeini. They brought in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Jimmy Carter went on for 30 years, speaking abroad, always against the United States, violating all protocols, A, of being a good American, and B, certainly of being an ex-president. It was, unfortunately, Mr. Obama, Senator Obama, who put as one of his senior advisors the architect of Jimmy Carter's horrible foreign policy, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski has endorsed Jimmy Carter's book and Walt and Mearsheimer's book on the Israel lobby. This is what's happening to the Democratic Party. He is not even considered a far-left anti-Israel Democrat. He's considered a mainstream Democrat. I have not heard Hillary Clinton rebuke Jimmy Carter. He is still the chairman of Democrats Abroad, which is an important honorific title. He's still campaigning all over the country, going district by district for Democrats. He gets big audiences on campuses, and I don't hear the Democrats rebuking Jimmy Carter. On the question of Ann Coulter, not my favorite. She's not an elected Republican. She doesn't speak for the Republican Party. She's a satirist, and at times I'm very frustrated with her point of view. As it happens, if you break down what she said, which I did not like, the example she used when she was asked who would be the best Democrat and who would be the best Republican, the best Democrat, she said, would be Joe Lieberman, a Jewish American, and the best Republican would be, in fact, Duncan Hunter, who spent years as chairman of the Armed Services Committee helping Israel build its missile defense program. Then she said, Jews all go to heaven. She's not my favorite, but to try to compare Jimmy Carter to Ann Coulter is a big mistake. Why? One of them loves Israel and one of them doesn't.
Andrew.
You know, it's funny you should bring up a couple of these here. Why is Iran as powerful as it is today? And the reason is because of Iraq. The reason has been that because there were two or three groups which were counterweights to Iran, and they're all gone. So the very people who you say right now have been pro-Israel and have been anti-Iran have actually been the people who are responsible for making Iran as powerful as it is today. I would also point out, and since we're talking about some of these presidential candidates, let's talk for a moment about Rudy Giuliani, who took money from the Saudis and from Hugo Chavez to represent and lobby on their behalf in the United States through Citgo. Let's talk for a minute about Fred Thompson, who chose Spencer Abraham, who was defeated by Debbie Stabenow, a Jewish senator from Michigan, who had a horrible anti-Israel record, and chosen him as his chair. And Brent Scowcroft, who was part of who was one of McCain's top foreign policy advisors and served very close with Jim Baker, who in the previous Bush administration could hardly be described as being pro-Israel. I will also talk a little bit about Joe Lieberman. I used to go to services with Joe Lieberman in Washington, D.C., and personally I find him one of the nicest people I've ever met in politics. But over time, his politics, not just internationally but domestically, have drifted. He was one of the chief opponents back in the 90s of the Defense of Marriage Act, and he very passionately got up and spoke against discriminating against people based on their sexual orientation. But now, with ENDA coming up, we're going to see where he really stands. Several other times he's had the chance to take positions that were progressive. It isn't just Iraq and what's going on abroad that makes progressives upset with Joe Lieberman. He stood by the credit card companies with the bankruptcy reform, and over again he's voted with more domestically socially conservative elements. And I'll say one last thing with regards to Duncan Hunter, which was just brought up. When Jewish Air Force cadets were being forcibly proselytized to, there was a defense authorization bill which contained protections for those Jewish Air Force cadets, and it was Duncan Hunter who stripped them out at the request of evangelicals. This man has not been a friend to the Jewish community as a whole. While he may have done some good things to Israel, he and other folks, when it came time to stand up for Jews in this country, came up sorely lacking. I don't think he's a good example at all.
For Larry, why do the Republicans seem to have a soft spot in their heart for Saudi Arabia? Would you agree that Saudi Arabia is a sponsor of terrorism and an enemy of Israel and should not be considered a friend of the United States?
Daniel Pipes wrote a powerful article called The Lesser of Two Evils, where he tried to explain that there are regimes like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia which are very bad. The Wahhabism that comes out of Saudi Arabia is one of the three pivot points of jihad. The others are the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt and the Shiites out of Iran. And his conclusion was, better the devil we know than Al-Qaeda and those who attacked us on 9/11 taking over Saudi Arabia and the oil fields. So it's a very problematic relationship. We removed our base from Saudi Arabia, our $15 billion base. The president has been much tougher on the Saudis than Republican or Democratic presidents since. You all know how that relationship with the Saudis began, right? In particular regarding the oil. After World War II, President Roosevelt went on a ship with King Ibn Saud and he cut the deal that the Saudis would be exempted and accepted from the wave of liberty and democracy and capitalism around the world. We would get their oil and we would leave the 7,000 princes alone. And Aramco cut its deal and the flow of oil continued with a West that was growing very rapidly with industrialization after World War II. It's been a very bad bet. You remember in his State of the Union when the president named countries, and he said specifically Egypt and Saudi Arabia have been a major problem with the madrasas and the funding and the deal that the princes cut with the clerics inside Saudi Arabia to allow them to create this jihad. It's a very difficult, very bad scenario in Saudi Arabia, and we're stuck because we don't want the Saudi government to fall and have Al-Qaeda take over.
I think they're probably talking about, I mentioned earlier, Rudy Giuliani's firm represented Saudi Arabia in several lobbying and legal proceedings here in the United States. I think that speaks to itself that Republicans as a whole, while they may be willing to talk tough, they've had a very difficult time in terms of following up with the actions. Several years ago, I talked about how that the Republican leadership tried to expand aid to Saudi Arabia without talking to Israel, and it was only when they got turned back by the Democrats that they actually learned the lesson of asking this time. But I think that it shows, I think, an unrealistic foreign policy expectation that they've put forward. We have to take on Saudi Arabia as both a friend but also pressure them and, to make sure that they stop teaching their children anti-Semitic messages and that they start treating their women with respect, etc. And it takes that kind of interaction back and forth. And I think overall this administration, and you're not going to hear me say this very often, but I think that the way that they've dealt with the Saudis has overall been a positive thing, because on one hand, as Larry pointed out, it is the lesser of other evils. I think they can do a little better, but they at least have tried to put pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop funding, to stop using these charities as fronts to support terrorist groups, etc. But it's that same approach in a way that Obama is being criticized for in wanting to talk to Iran, not give them their way, but at least be able to have the discussions. And I would also point out that while this administration is condemning people for wanting to talk to Syria and Iran, this administration is talking to Syria and Iran through back channels. So again, the actions aren't matching up. They really don't want people to talk with them and make it like high school with, I don't like you, so I'm not going to talk with you till you see the world my way. They can try, but that's not how the world has ever worked. That's how we've gotten North Korea in line, is we talk directly with North Korea and with other countries. And we've gotten a lot farther with that than we did under this administration's previous approach, which is the same one they've been using with the other countries in the Middle East. I'm not going to talk to you. Well, they're going to keep doing what they're doing, and unless we find a way of at least opening a dialogue with United Nations Security. This particular United Nations Secretary General has been very open in his support in Israel and has openly taken on many of these terrorist nations, rogue nations, in terms of their behavior. Was Kofi Annan as good at that? Probably not. I think we can all agree with that. But this current one, Bonn, has been much better, and the Security Council has been, for the most part, much better than it's been in the past.
So I need a couple minutes, because this is an important question which points out what my opening statement was all about, the difference in resolve between the parties. Starting with George McGovern's long discredited naivete regarding Israel and the Middle East and foreign policy, and continuing with the Church Commission of the 1970s, the Democratic Congress, which defunded and devalued human intelligence gathering, which helped lead up to 9/11. You saw in the 1980s Democrats opposing every step of the way Ronald Reagan's confrontation of evil. In fact, they didn't allow him to use the term evil empire, yet he rescued Natan Sharansky and 1 million Soviet Jews came to Israel. In the 90s, we saw further Democrat weakness in President Clinton's failure to respond to World Trade Center 1, the attack in '93, the attack on the Khobar Towers, the attack on the embassies in East Africa and Kenya and Tanzania, the attack on the Cole in 2000. All of this happened, weakness in Democrat foreign policy. Now we get to the United Nations. I have a special place in my... I think everybody here is aware of the fact that Libya and Sudan and Iran, in fact, Iran is the chairman of the Proliferation Committee. How's that? Yeah. Jewish Democrats, and there are 40 Jewish Democrats in Congress. There are only 3 Jewish Republicans in Congress, 2 senators, Norm Coleman and Arlen Specter, and Congressman Eric Cantor, who's number 3 or 4 in the House. Jewish Democrats shamefully and uniformly opposed the magnificent John Bolton as our ambassador to the United Nations. Even after, years ago, he had personally led the effort to repeal the Zionism is racism canard. It is terribly important that you understand Democrats did not support this hero. He's not Jewish, this great man, John Bolton. Republicans like Senator Coleman battle for UN reform and an end to the routine bashing of Israel. Some 40 or 50% of all the resolutions that come out of the new Human Rights Council was supposed to be an improvement after the Durban Hate Israel Fest, are bashing of Israel, selected out. Many Democrats repeatedly apologize for a body which has broken its promises to prevent war, alleviate human suffering, or rescue victims of genocide over 60 years from Rwanda to Darfur. The difference between the parties vis-a-vis the United Nations is huge.
And who says Republicans don't oversimplify? Look, frankly, this administration, if this administration was so concerned about the United Nations and trying to make sure that it was its position on Israel was changed, they wouldn't have filed complaints with the filed complaints about the way that the Israelis treat the Palestinians. Only two presidents have done this: George W. Bush and Richard Nixon, both Republicans. A lot of the statements that you've just heard with regards to lost opportunities I would say, are equally disingenuous with regards to Al-Qaeda and with what's happened with regards to Sudan, etc. Bill Clinton has been very clear about what actually happened with those discussions, and that it was actually Sudan that dropped the ball on this, that we said we would be open to it, and then things sort of fell apart with regards to other issues. There's other repeated examples, but John Bolton was put down, was opposed by Democrats. It had little to do with what he's done with regards to, has less to do with what happened with Israel than his approach to everybody who doesn't agree with him, which is to berate and yell at them. And this is not how you do international diplomacy. This is not how Bill Richardson did diplomacy. This is, it's unheard of. Even when, when Adlai Stevenson was up there humiliating the Russians in the Security Council back in the 1960s, there was still discussions going back and forth, and it wasn't this juvenile approach of, I'm not going to talk with you and you're bad if I don't deal with you. A lot more changes made in terms of reforming the United Nations happened because Clinton had built up good relationships with the United Nations so that they could ask for these changes to be made.
Just 10 seconds on that. I don't know how you both give credit to Ambassador Bolton for the progress on the North Korean issue, but then say that he can't get along with anybody and he can't solve any problems.
That's true. The answer is this, is that for the first years that Bolton was in office, he refused to even go through multilateral discussions and just said, we're not going to deal with you. It wasn't until in the last, basically I'd say around 2006, 2005, when finally this administration went back to what the previous administration did with true multilateral talks with the United States actually being present at those talks. That's the difference. Maybe Bolton learned his lesson and figured out after Iraq we can't solve all the world's problems by ourselves.
There's 5 seconds. Actually, you're quite wrong, of course. It was Senator Kerry in the 2004 race who blamed the president for not having direct negotiations with the North Koreans. It was President Bush and finally Ambassador Bolton who pulled together the six-party talks to make progress on North Korea.
This is really the last word on this.
That is not accurate. For the first couple of years, they said they would not deal with, they wouldn't take part in it. They just had to do what the United States said.
All right, to Larry. Wouldn't you admit that there is an important strain in the Republican Party that is not friendly to Israel? Do you think Condoleezza Rice, James Baker, Brent Scowcroft, George Bush Sr., Ron Paul, and Pat Buchanan are supporters of Israel? Aren't they important figures in the Republican Party? And if so, what does that say about the Republican Party being friendly to Jews?
So we could take them one by one. We'll be here all day. But as far as friendly to Jews, President Bush Sr. helped lead the rescue of Ethiopian Jewry. And I think he'll be remembered very warmly by international Jewry for that action. And it was a magnificent effort. James Baker's not on my favorite list, and I don't get his Christmas cards. Condoleezza Rice is now captured by the State Department. And that is, by the way, Bill Clinton, of course, went on a victory lap, a tour of the Arab states after his presidency, picked up quite a few checks from the Arab Gulf states. It is difficult. The State Department, there are 52 or 54 Muslim nations. There are 22 Arab states. They all have embassies and consulates, and they all have offices in Washington at the State Department at Foggy Bottom. So there's a huge pressure built up. They all want to get along in their countries. They all come back and they all lobby the Secretary of State, hey, this is what we're hearing from Morocco and from Jordan and from Iraq, etc. It is very difficult to remain resolute at the State Department, which is why I'm very happy we have this president who doesn't believe, like Senator Kerry did, and I guess many other Democrats do, that there should be a global test for American foreign policy. I heard already about how we should get along with the world. Actually, the resolve of the United States, the strength of the United States, the confrontation of jihad is working. Guess why? France and Germany had their presidents and prime ministers both visit last week. They're both more conservative governments elected, and not coincidentally, I won't run on too long. Not coincidentally, both are more conservative governments and better friends of the United States and Israel. And I would cite not just France and Germany, but practically all of Eastern Europe and Japan and India have never been more strategically close to the United States, and Australia's John Howard conservative, and the election in Canada, Stephen Harper, pro-Israel conservative, pro-America, and Mexico, actually, and other countries in Latin and South America. Countries that become more conservative and want to work with a president and an administration that they trust will keep its word and be resolved in foreign policy, tend to actually get along better with the United States and therefore with Israel.
I would just point out with regards to France, Chirac was from the same party as Sarkozy. The difference is just Chirac felt that he was a was that right? I had to get Chirac right. Chirac was an Arab, was always an Arabist, and at least he's been replaced by someone who's been a lot better. But that had less to do to the United States as well. But the problem has been with many of these countries is if we only support conservatives, encourage policies in countries that the rise of middle class, then you create the Hugo Chavez's of the world. You create the Fidel Castros. And that's a little bit of what's happening now, even to an extent in Mexico, where we have an entire state almost entirely underwater. And that administration has been very slow to respond because it tends to be one of the more, it's basically become almost like the Katrina for Mexico. Let's talk for a little bit about a couple of these folks. The fact that George Bush did help with the Ethiopian Jews is not a bad thing. But he also several times threatened to cut off or reduce aid to Israel unless they followed his policy under James Baker, who has very clearly said the Jews don't vote for us, so them. I'm in polite company. You've got folks like Ray LaHood, who was until last year was the chair was a chair of a subcommittee in the intelligence committee in the Select Committee on Intelligence. He's a Lebanese Christian who has openly opposed efforts to support Israel and has sided with Hezbollah. Darrell Issa was the same thing. The difference is, when we have our Cynthia McKinney, who is now a member of the Green Party, we voted her out. What's happening with Jones from Georgia, who is going around and who is one of the few Republicans to oppose referring Ahmadinejad over to the United Nations Security Council for incitement to genocide? He's still there. LaHood is retiring this year, but he could have stayed there as long as he wanted. Darrell Issa, when Dana Rohrabacher said that he thought that Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat were cut from the same cloth, he is still there. He's gotten a lot better, by the way. I do want to give the RJC credit for bringing him into line. But they don't discipline their own when they get out of line. The Democrats, we do. Jesse Jackson is not what he once was in this party, and part of it is because of a position with regards to the Jewish community. And that's why in 2006, depending on which poll you read, anywhere from 78 to 80 to 90% of Jews in this country voted Democratic because they were fed up with the Republican line and the Republican inconsistencies. Now, he's going to bring up the RJC poll that says it was a lot lower. I personally would rather, I would personally rather listen to Gallup or CNN than to have a Republican tell me, I did my own poll and here's what I found out. Because it's going to be biased. It's like having a Democratic pollster come out and say, guess what? Everyone really agrees with the Democrats. Of course you're going to take that with a grain of salt. But the bottom line here is, according to the Pew Research Institute, 77% of Jews opposed the war in Iraq. As much as, according to CNN and all the other groups, as much as 80% of Jews vote Democrat. When it comes to protecting Israel and protecting Jews here in this country, Democrats have the more consistent and the better record. And they hold their people accountable who don't stay in line with that.
So I haven't had a chance to say much about Iraq. The Israelis seem to have had sufficient concern about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction program and potential nuclear proliferation, meaning the state gives it to terror cells, as far back as 1981, when they successfully hit the French-built Osirak reactor. They were wrongly condemned, but Vice President Cheney, among others, has repeatedly stated that the world was safer and American troops certainly were safer during Operation Desert Storm in '91. Please remember that Saddam lobbed Scuds at Israel in 1991. Iraq, of course, did finance the murder of Israelis and fund terrorism. That ended with the liberation of Iraq. Arguably, we have planted a seed of democratization in the Arab world, dealt a blow to dictatorship and its model in the Arab Muslim world, prevented and preempted a ruthless dictator from continuing to attack American interests and Israel, saved millions of Iraqi lives, shown force in a region that mostly respects only force, cowed Libya into turning in its weapons of mass destruction program, which is now in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and by the way, helped to unravel, therefore, the AQ-Khan terror network, which meant that the Israelis on September 6th felt confident enough to attack, like they did in '81 in Iraq, eastern Syria, which was North Korean nuclear proliferation. By the way, an attack which revealed that Russian anti-aircraft capabilities are weak or non-existent in Syria, no matter what the cost. And it's the same system that the Iranians have, which is why you saw a panic in Iran over the last 2 months, including the firing of their Iranian proliferation negotiator, Larijani. I just wanted to put on the table, there's a balanced way when we discuss Iraq. On balance, I'm very proud of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
To Andrew,
yes.
Wouldn't you agree that the Democratic candidate's opposition to the use of force against Iran makes it more likely that Iran will obtain nuclear weapons and therefore be a greater threat to the survival of Israel?
Actually, I just got an article, op-ed published in this week's Jewish Journal on this issue, in which I talk about how that progressives and most pro-Israel organizations have the same feeling with regards to military action against Iran. AIPAC opposes, they don't want military action taken off the table as an option, but they oppose military action against Iran. I saw Howard Berman come up and speak in front of our organization only a couple of weeks ago and say that if we right now attack Iran, that it will evaporate whatever goodwill we have left, and we're stretched so thin in Iraq that we can't do it anyway because we missed the real threat, and the real threat was ultimately Iran. I think for those of us who have seen the presidential candidates speak over and over again, we see a very compressed version when we're on television. I saw John Edwards speak in front of the National Jewish Democratic Council, in which he went on for about 15 minutes about the need to take on Iran through sanctions and diplomatic pressure and multi-party talks like we've done in North Korea. Obama has been very clear from the very beginning that while he prefers not to take the military option off the table, he thinks that we can solve this problem through a dialogue, either direct or with other parties. Clinton's the same way. But if we keep on responding in this way of solely threatening military action, then Iran is going to continue to act like a teenager. And for those of you who have teenagers, what happens when you tell them not to do something? They do it. Well, Iran is, a lot of what we're doing in terms of the pressure is actually making the Iranian people, who actually like the United States quite a bit, they're making them run to support the Iranian government because they don't want bombs falling on them. There are better ways in which we can take on Iran, and frankly, I think that the Democrats have at least been willing to explore those, whereas for the most part, most of the Republicans have really just engaged in saber rattling. And if they were serious about that, then they would release the Iran Sanctions Enabling Act so that we can put some real teeth and let the states take on Iran as well.
So whenever I have a statement about how militaristic the Republicans are, I think it's helpful to share just a word or two about our foreign policy, which has a lot more to it than just operations of our military. U.S. foreign policy includes human intelligence gathering, the sharing of information with our allies, and the efforts round the clock, night and day, to disrupt terrorism and terrorist financing, although the New York Times kind of hurt one of our efforts by revealing it to the world. Political and diplomatic initiatives, and what is called the Bush administration's economic foreign policy for prosperity, integration, and security. This is an effort to, for example, revolutionize development assistance. The United States has quadrupled aid to sub-Saharan Africa. We were the lead gift of $18 billion to combat AIDS in Africa. And then the president went back and doubled down. It's now $30 billion lead gift. We're trying to have $60 billion around the world to combat AIDS. Through the Millennium Challenge accounts, standards have been set. So we try to incentivize countries to work with the West, grow their economies, promote human rights for women and for children, and they get more aid if their grade goes up in how they treat their own people. Our economic engagement around the world is at an all-time high. It's opening up markets, leveling the playing field. It's a force for growth and security. This week we did the Panama deal. Still on the table are Peru and South Korea and Colombia. These are trade agreements of California's economy very much. Historic global growth is rife in the world. It's the first time since 1960 that less than 10 million children in a year will die before they reach the age of 2. And strong domestic growth, and therefore we've been an engine for the world's economy. It is clear that security and stability and economic isolation go hand in hand. We actually have an incredible record as the United States foreign policy and economic diplomatic initiatives around the world to work with the world and hopefully improve the conditions so that we have swamps that are drained and terrorism can't take hold.
Since this has turned into sort of a broad sort of discussions on platitudes and foreign policy, just want to very quickly take the other side of this. That this administration refused to directly talk with anybody who refuses to meet their set of preconditions and under any circumstances. And the couple of times when they actually did so, like for instance with regards to Iran, what's happening with the Shiite militias in Iraq, that's what and the multilateral talks in North Korea, that's what yielded the results. There have been reduced foreign aid. The Republicans have attempted to reduced foreign aid across the board, everywhere except for one area, the war in Iraq. We now have $24 billion in foreign aid all around the world, which is about how much it costs to run the war 2 months in Iraq. And not because of support with regards to our military, it's because of these bloated contractors such as Blackwater, Halliburton, amongst others, that are getting the lion's share, a significant portion of this money. And this administration has refused to hold them accountable and make sure the money is being spent. There are billions of dollars that have not been accounted for in Iraq. They don't know where it went. And when we talk a little bit about some of the free trade agreements, I've been educated a little bit more about them, more in favor of free trade as a general approach, as do most of the Democratic candidates. But when you have poorly drafted sections saying that if, let's say, an American company takes a Canadian company to court, like what happened with the MTBEs here in this country, do you remember that, in California? where these MTBEs made in Canada, the main company that makes them is in Canada. California banned them because of its effect on the environment. Well, the Canadian company can now go in to an arbitrator that doesn't have to publish its decision and has required the United States reimburse them for the cost of the lost business. We need to be, free trade is a good thing, but the way that this administration has been free trade with no oversight whatsoever. International labor standards continue to drop. We have things coming in from toys coming in from China with lead, and meanwhile this administration, including the head of the commission that's supposed to be overseeing this, telling them we don't need the staff. Whose interest do they really have in mind? I don't feel like they're watching out for me or necessarily anyone that I know.
To Larry, why have so many Jewish Republican supporters of Israel failed to protest President Bush's broken promise to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
So it's a good question. As a supporter of moving our embassy to Israel's capital, I'm disappointed as well. This was a bill that passed in 1995. That Bob Dole pushed, Senator Dole, Republican, and actually Senator Feinstein said she would support it, and then she didn't, which was a double switch against the pro-Israel community. And unfortunately, since that time, both under President Clinton and President Bush, always, every 6 months, have to explain that it's not quite right to move the embassy. I would certainly join the call for moving the embassy to Jerusalem.
The House actually passed a resolution this year, again reminding the President of his obligations under the Jerusalem Embassy Act, something which we really didn't see much under the Republicans. The truth of the matter is we both know that politicians come to us from both sides and say, I'm going to do it, and then when they get elected, they don't do it. But it is important that we, Democrat or Republican, remind this administration and future administrations of that promise and that obligation, because Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And actually, my organization, Democrats for Israel, has been involved with filing friend of the court briefs with regards to the United States State Department. When people are born in Jerusalem, they don't say you're born in Jerusalem, Israel. They just say you're born in Jerusalem. And several people have sued to get that changed. And my organization has been proud to be a part of that effort to recognize Jerusalem as what it should be, the capital of Israel.
You want to rebut? No. To Andrew. The Olmert administration is extremely unpopular in Israel right now and unlikely to survive much longer. If it's replaced by an administration that no longer wants to pursue a two-state solution, do you believe the Democratic candidates, if one of them were elected to be president, would be supportive of Israel, or would it attempt to pressure Israel to implement a two-state solution? Despite its objection? Well,
with the exception of one or two parties that I can think of, even Likud supports a two-state solution. They just don't believe that they've got a partner for peace in front of them. So I view that as highly unlikely. I do know that, for instance, when Yitzhak Shamir refused to negotiate or talk with the Palestinians, George Bush threatened to cut off housing guarantees. I don't think a Democratic president would do that sort of thing, because they recognize the importance of support of Israel. And we don't want to have a repeat of 1973, when you have, again, Nixon Secretary of State Rogers threatening to cut off aid to Israel if we wouldn't do what the Nixon administration wanted. And there's some people who feel that may have led to the 1973 war, because they believe that the United States was backing off its support of Israel. Every Democrat I know of who has the chance of winning, and I don't count Dennis Kucinich or Gravel amongst those, has been very clear that they stand by the relationship with Israel and support its efforts to live in a secure peace with its neighbors, how it sees best.
So this would be a short chance to clean up on one particular issue that I didn't want to leave unaddressed, which was the claim that House Republicans voted against aid to Israel. There was a vote on final passage of a bill containing all the funds for the Department of State and foreign aid. There was never a standalone vote on aid to Israel. The Washington Post reported that the Democrat leaders of the House made a calculated decision to insert into a bill a divisive abortion-related provision, after they had been warned that the provision, overturning long-standing prohibitions on subsidies for overseas abortion, would guarantee a presidential veto. The bill was supported by a significant number of Republicans anyways, and opposed by a significant number of Democrats. In nearly every instance, the defections or support tracked with the members' various views on abortion. Republicans wrote to AIPAC to affirm their support for the Israel aid package, making it clear that they looked forward to voting for legislation that once again provided such funding without the shenanigans that the Democrats had put into it. This has happened again on the issue of Turkey. The Democrats, right at the worst possible moment, pushed forward something very meretricious, which was the commemoration of the 1915 genocide of Armenians by then Ottoman Empire Turkey. Right when the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, had an incursion into Turkey, and Turkey was nervous and threatening to move into Iraq, that's when the Democrats decided to push forward the bill commemorating a 1915, that's a century ago, horrible genocide of the Armenians, which all of us obviously condemn. This is a repeated pattern now by this Democratic Congress, which is to take important moments in national security, foreign aid to Israel, the situation in Iraq, and politicize them for partisan purposes, and it's shameful.
You know, it's funny because the Mexico City Declaration was put in by a Republican Congress, and at the time, Democratic Congress members and Democratic President complained and said, you know, look, we don't think it's right that you're doing this. And by the way, it's not abortion, it's just contraceptive. It's making family services, planning services available to making aid available to family planning services to non-governmental organization. It's not abortion. That being said, when that first got passed in the early 90s, Democrats voted for aid to Israel even though it was in that because they believed that aid to Israel was more important. That was their most important obligation. But when the Republicans were given that opportunity to say, you know something, we're concerned about family planning, but aid to Israel is more important, they came up short. I would also add that out of the 169 people that representatives that voted against that bill, 146 of them were Republicans. That's not a lot of Democrats. That's a very small number of Democrats. In addition, the Republican leadership also pushed for the Price Amendment, named for Price from Georgia, which wanted a across-the-board 1% aid cut, including an aid cut to Israel. So, no, they've politicized this quite a bit. And every time in the past that you saw aid packages come up on the other side, and these same 10 Democrats voted against it. It was, look how anti-Israel the Democrats are. Those 10 Democrats voted against this bill. But the Democratic leadership always stood by supporting Israel, and that came through. So I think it's very disingenuous to talk about politicizing it when the Republicans have repeatedly done so, I think sometime not to the benefit of Israel or anybody else.
Well, let me just clarify on politicizing. Ron Paul was not invited to the Republican Jewish Coalition Forum, but all the Democrats did go to the Daily Kos Yearly Kos Convention. Now, what is the Yearly Kos, which is the convention of the Daily Kos organization? Robert Goldberg wrote a powerful piece that Democrat candidates, with the exception of Joe Biden, I'd like to note, who's a fabulous pro-Israel Democrat, trekked to Chicago to speak at the convention of the Daily Kos. The blogs of the 21st century version of the public square were told. Ask Eyal Rosenberg, who resigned as the diarist of the Daily Kos on May 9th after, in his words, all the Israel hate spewing out of one too many diaries around here. Reading these past months on Daily Kos has led me to believe that the people here, Democrats under the progressive banner, support views that end up in one place: me dead. Mr. Rosenberg is not the only one they want to kill. Recently, a Daily Kos diary suggested gassing Joe Lieberman like a dog. He's often called Jew Lieberman, just like Rudy Giuliani is called Giuliani. This is a leading Democrat website. MoveOn.org is even worse. I'm just using the more quote, moderate group. When asked, all the Democratic presidential candidates were given a chance not to go to the Daily Kos convention. They all said, no, we can't sacrifice our relationship with the left. It's driving our party now. Hillary Clinton, of course, went to this convention. The quotes from the Huffington Post, another leading liberal blog here in town. End Israel. Now is the hour for Iran, Syria, and Russia to utterly crush Israel. The beloved baby-killing IDF will be saved, though. Israel's not a democracy. Israel's just as violent, as vicious as anybody. Israel's wrong and America's wrong. Israel's a terrorist state. America's a terrorist state. Israel's not interested in peace. By the way, AIPAC endorsed the views of the Republicans who said that the Democrats had politicized the foreign aid bill. Of course, Israel got its foreign aid when they cleaned up the bill.
Certainly. There was a letter published from AIPAC saying this bill is important and we ask you to vote for it. They sent out a letter to Republicans, Democrats alike, and we can see how they all voted. I would also point out, I think it's kind of funny to compare the Daily Kos to the RJC. I can tell you, I mean, I know that Gravel didn't come to the NJDC event, and but when the candidates were free to speak, and then afterwards, when they were free to speak, we were free to disagree with them very loudly. And the problem with things like the Daily Kos, and I'm actually on the Daily Kos, I argue with these people as well, but at least it's open and everyone can get involved. The conservative blogs don't allow people to come on and speak, so of course you're only going to get one set of information. I don't know, how many of you actually go on these blogs and read them? Raise your hand.
I rec for one, and you're welcome anytime.
I would be glad to take part in it, but there are many that don't. There are several that I've been interested in trying to get a balanced view on, and I can't get on because they only have openings on rare Sundays because they don't want to hear an opposing viewpoint. When you get these opposing viewpoints, you're going to have your share, for lack of a better term, your share of wingnuts. Okay, on both sides. The difference here is at least is at least on the Democratic Party is that they're going to give them the freedom of speech to say what they want. But I will say this much, especially with regards to Move On. Move On has actually been much better about. I've actually personally spoken with Eli Pariser, who's Jewish, who's the executive director of Move On. They have been conscious in terms of backing off, restricting people in terms of the unmerited criticisms, particularly with regards to Iran. There was for a while kind of a drumbeat of no preemptive war. That has stopped. Same with George Soros, who is the main financier of the original creation of Move On. He has actually been one of the leading opponents of spreading nuclear technology to Iran, and several of his aides were arrested. You heard about those arrests from the in Iran of dual citizens. Those are people from Soros' organization who are trying to talk about democracy in Iran. But they have figured out you have to engage. You can't reach out with a closed fist.
All right. What I'm going to now have each one person do is summarize the positions of each of who they consider to be the major candidates for president on the Middle East and Israel in particular, since we're not exactly sure who's going to be nominated from each party and why that person, because of that policy, is deserving of American Jewish support. Start with Larry.
So starting then in the poll terms at the bottom, Senator Edwards was cruising along with a litany of liberal causes when during question time he was asked about Israel. Perhaps the greatest short-term threat to world peace, Senator Edwards remarked, was the possibility that Israel would preemptively bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. As a chill gathered, Edwards' event was brought to a polite close. Mr. Obama, his longtime pastor, Senator Obama, is Jeremiah Wright. This is not a fan of the pro-Israel community and the people in this room. Quote, the Israelis have illegally occupied Palestinian territories for almost 40 years now. It took a divestment campaign to wake up the business community concerning the South Africa issue. Divestment has now hit the table again as a strategy against Zionism. Mr. Obama, I already mentioned, picked Brzezinski as a major advisor of his. Brzezinski, quote, was a major obstacle to bridging the divisions between the president and the Jewish community, said Mark Siegel, Carter's Jewish liaison, until resigning in a dispute. Mr. Obama, in his own words, said, "Hey, I'm sorry I haven't said more about Palestine right now, but we are in a tough primary race. I'm hoping when things calm down, I can be more upfront." He referred to his activism, including columns when he was contributing to the Chicago Tribune, critical of Israeli and U.S. policy. "Keep up the good work," he was told. Mr. Obama had not a good record on Israel until he ran for U.S. Senate and discovered the pro-Israel community in Chicago. As a senator, Mr. Obama said, "The creation of a wall dividing the two nations is yet another example of the neglect of this administration in brokering peace." He was not in favor of the security fence. Democrats support the International Court of Justice, which ruled 14-1 against Israel's security fence, a security fence which has reduced by 95% the homicide-suicide bombings against Israel. On Mrs. Clinton. Mrs. Clinton denies screaming an anti-Semitic slur at Dick Morris, but he insists that it happened. Her record on Israel and Jewish issues is less than sympathetic. She called for a Palestinian state with no preconditions placed on the Palestinians themselves. This was done as she was kissing Suha Arafat, seconds after the terrorist's wife accused Jews of poisoning the river where the Palestinian children play. I doubt Mrs. Clinton supports blood libel, but she did not condemn the remarks either or apologize for her warm embrace of Mrs. Arafat. She has never apologized for Yasser Arafat being given the royal red carpet treatment at the White House on many occasions. I mentioned that she went to the Daily Kos convention. On the Republicans, briefly, Fred Thompson has given magnificent statements on Iran, and he had a good record in the Senate regarding Israel. Senator McCain has a 25-year record of support of the Jewish state, and it's very clear and stipulated too. Governor Romney. Governor Romney is a magnificent person. He's become a personal friend. His advisors are friends of the Republican Jewish Coalition. His supporters are a who's who of pro-Israel Jewish Republicans. He himself is very close to Bibi Netanyahu, whom he worked with at Bain Capital in Massachusetts. Governor Romney ordered all state agencies to refuse any assistance if it was requested when the former president of Iran visited Massachusetts in September of '06. Stating state taxpayers should not be providing special treatment to an individual who supports violent jihad and the destruction of Israel. Khatami oversaw the torture and murder of Iranian students, journalists, and others who spoke out for freedom and democracy. In his famous Herzliya conference statement, the Republican Jewish Coalition took Governor Romney to Israel last January. He said, quote, "We should have realized since 9/11 that what the world regarded as the Israeli-Arab conflict over borders represented all along something much larger. It was the oldest, most active front of the radical Islamist jihad against the entire West. It was therefore not really about borders at all. It was about the refusal of many parts of the Muslim world to accept Israel's right to exist within any borders. This distinction came into vivid focus in the summer of '86 when the war in Lebanon had little to do with the Palestinians. It had nothing to do with the two-state solution. It demonstrated that Israel is now facing a jihadist front from Tehran through Damascus to southern Lebanon and Gaza." Finally, Rudy Giuliani, the frontrunner for the Republicans. When Prince Alaouid Ben Talal suggested that the 9/11 attacks were an indication that the United States should re-examine its policies in the Middle East and adopt a more balanced stand toward the Palestinian cause, Mayor Giuliani asserted, "No. There is no moral equivalence for this terrorist act. There is no justification for it. And one of the reasons I think this happened is because people were engaged in moral equivalency, in not understanding the differences between liberal democracies like the United States and like Israel, and terrorist states and those that condone terrorism." So I think not only are those statements wrong, they're part of the problem, and he rejected the $10 million donation to disaster relief, by the way, after he called every one of the families of the victims of 9/11. Mayor Giuliani kicked out Yasser Arafat from the Lincoln Center in 1995, stating he would not invite Arafat to anything, anywhere, anytime, any place, and I don't forget. He later said, I'm proud of this decision, booting Arafat. I'd make it again, and on the day I'd stop making it is the day I'd resign as mayor. When I write my memoirs, it's one of the things I will probably be proudest of. Mayor Giuliani has been called a neocon for surrounding himself with incredibly brilliant pro-Israel leaders, thinkers, scholars of 40 years. In 1996, he purposely went to Jerusalem to ride a bus line hit by terrorists earlier in the year out of solidarity. He said terrorist acts became a ticket to the international bargaining table. How else to explain Yasser Arafat winning the Nobel Prize when he was supporting a terrorist plague in the Middle East that undermined any chance of peace? Israel is the only outpost of freedom and democracy in the Middle East and the only absolutely reliable friend of the United States of America. I could go on, but Rudy Giuliani sued the terrorists. That's what he did in the Reagan administration. That's what he did as the U.S. Attorney in New York. That's what he did as the mayor of New York. He is our friend.
All right, since we want to attack the other side first, let's go through a couple of these right here very quickly. There's been quite a bit made of the surge of Ron Paul and his fundraising. Dr. No, Ms. Dr. No, as you know him. But I don't really view him as ultimately a viable candidate for the Republicans, although he probably will run as an independent because there's a good number of Republicans who are upset with the war in Iraq and who have a libertarian streak. Fred Thompson has Spencer Abraham as his campaign chair, which I mentioned earlier, who, when in the United States Senate, was one of the most anti-Israel United States senators, and was defeated by Debbie Stabenow, who is currently the senator and is Jewish. McCain has Brent Scowcroft as one of his top foreign policy advisors, who is very close with James Baker and has followed his policies. And one of his main money men, although the name is currently escaping me at this moment, when he worked for Nixon, and Nixon went off about the Jewish cabal against him, he was responsible for rooting out and identifying this Jewish cabal. He still serves as one of the top money men for McCain. With regards to Romney, I'll be honest with you, instead of trying to dig up and take statements out of context, the most upsetting thing that I've found about Romney personally has been that he chose to launch his campaign in front of the Ford Museum, which I think shows a certain insensitivity. I'd like to see him stand up and say that he disagrees with the Mormon Church's policy of posthumously converting Jews to Mormonism. And I found that and also I'd like to see him be able, he's been rather unapologetic in the support of the war in Iraq. But to be honest with you, with the Jews in his own states, he's had an okay record, as much as a governor can have a record, because you're not really doing foreign policy. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Giuliani. I know Giuliani, New York politics, as you know, the Jewish community is very important. He probably would never have been elected against Dinkins if it wasn't for the Jewish community's support. But I would also say that his decisions as terms of the, quote, geniuses that he surrounded himself on foreign policy are very disturbing, because these are all the people who have been cooked out of the Bush administration because of the Iraq war. These are the Daniel Pipes, the Potterses, etc., who basically are responsible for creating a strong Iran as we have it today. I would also point out that on one hand, while he's willing to talk tough and maybe even did some good things when he was Attorney General, in business for himself, when it came to the almighty buck, he was certainly willing to take a check from the Saudis and from Citgo, which is owned mostly by Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelans. Now, on the Democratic side, I will say this much. I find the mentioning of what happened with Clinton in back with Suha a ridiculous comparison. At that point, everyone except for the most hardened folks believed that we had an opportunity for peace, and they opened the door. And once they found out that that Arafat was not interested in opening that door and walking through the door, that door got shut. But to mention something that happened prior to that door shutting is just low. It's taking things completely out of context. I will also say, with regards to as being a United States Senator from New York, she has enjoyed the support of many leaders in the Jewish community, even here in Los Angeles, folks like Daphne Ziman, who was a former officer with AIPAC, and you will not find a stronger advocate for Israel, is very close and is a strong supporter of Clinton. Also, the former chairman, and I'm not remembering his name right now, of the DNC, who used to be Steve Grossman, who's former DNC chair, former chair of AIPAC, is also a very strong supporter of Hillary Clinton. Obama's relationship with the Jewish community goes much further back than the United States Senate. One of the reasons he was able to get elected to the state Senate in the first place is because he was willing to reach out to the Jewish community when many, including some of those in this church you mentioned, were not willing to do so. He has made a career of building bridges across communities. And I have seen some of the most hateful emails where they point out his middle name is Hussein. That must mean he's he's Muslim. He is not Muslim, and his record both in the United States and in the state Senate has been very pro-Israel and pro-Jewish community from the very beginning. It almost, in my opinion, smacks of racism in some ways. Now, with regards to Edwards, he has actually had a very strong record throughout with regards to Israel. I know that Mark Stanley, vice chair of the NJDC, has been very supportive of him, and many of his top advisors. When he was in the United States Senate, he had a very good record with regards to supporting Israel. And when he ran for president 4 years ago, he's had a very strong record in doing so. I have no reason to believe that strong wouldn't exist. Are some of the folks who tend to be pacifistic pushing him? Yeah, but I've seen him speak in front of groups where he's talked about in depth the issues as opposed to these little sound bites you see. And he's actually been very good about making clear that we can't look at a Palestinian state until we have a partner for peace. We cannot go into, we have to pressure Iran to support what's happening, to comply with international requirements. Richardson, Biden, and Dodd all have excellent records with regards to Israel going back many years, and I think even Larry said as such. With regards to Kucinich, I view Kucinich much like with regards to Ron Paul. They're both ideologues in their own way. Ron Paul is a libertarian, even to the point of, by the way, voting against money for immunization for children. Kucinich is a pacifist. No matter what, he's for peace. He is what he is. But he's not going to get the nomination. In a Clinton, an Obama, or an Edwards, you're going to see a very strong administration that supports whoever is there in Israel, not just the Likud, which the Republican Party seems to only support Likud.
30 seconds, Larry, then 30 seconds back to Andrew.
Just a little cleanup. Unfortunately, Senator Obama has been very rough on Israel regarding the cluster bombs in Lebanon. Number two, on Hillary, we'll just have to agree to disagree. When she didn't say anything, when Suha Arafat said Jews poisoned Palestinian children, that's a big deal to me. And finally, on Governor Romney, I know you guys beat this on the issue of having his kickoff launch of his campaign at the Ford Museum. Actually, Henry Ford of many, many, many decades ago was not a good guy, was an anti-Semite. He ran for Senate, of course, as a Democrat. Nowadays, the Ford family in Detroit has an incredible relationship with the Jewish community in Detroit, and the Jewish community has events at the Ford Museum, and they were very upset with Jewish Democrats for castigating Governor Romney for having an event at an economic museum dedicated to 21st century problem solving in our economy. Shame on you for picking that as your example against Governor Romney.
Andrew.
With regards to the cluster bombs, the government of Israel has been hard on Ehud, on the government with regards to the use of cluster bombs and how that war was fought. It was across the board. That's why we have the Winograd Commission. It seems disingenuous to say to us, hey, we can't say that we have the same problem that the Israelis are talking to themselves about, particularly us in the Jewish community. I really have to say that, while these folks have been willing to talk really tough on the Republican side, with regards to Israel, their records, just for the most part, particularly at least Giuliani's business record, and a lot of what you've seen from these other candidates don't always show it. And you need to look more at just what they're saying, because they're going to say the right thing to what they think their base is. With regards to within the Jewish community, those small number of Jews who vote Republican, many of whom are probably here in the room, they tend to be very conservative and very hardline with regards. But 75 to 80% of the Jewish community have a different approach, and those people are going to vote and continue to vote Democrat because they agree with the positions of the Democratic candidates, not just domestically, but with regards to Iraq and with regards to how to handle Iran and all these other issues as well.
We're going to wrap with closing statements. Larry and then Andrew, again, why your party best reflects the values of the Jewish community and would represent its interests going forward.
So I believe the Democratic Party today seeks the votes of anti-war leftists. And by the way, Muslim Americans vote 9-1 now for the Democratic Party. It raises the issue of Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison is the first Muslim congressman. Nothing wrong with that. He chose not to swear in on the Bible, but instead on the Quran, and the Democrats tried to make a big deal out of Dennis Prager saying, I would have preferred that he acknowledged the Judeo-Christian background of America. But the point is that then Dennis Prager was proved right, and Keith Ellison was proved wrong, because what he then went to do, and especially this audience, children of Jewish Holocaust survivors, he compared President Bush to Hitler, and he said that 9/11 was like the Reichstag fire, which brought the Nazis to power. He is not our friend. 3 major points. On illegal immigration, I did save for my notes for the conclusion because I do take offense. I didn't hear a single Republican, neither in Republican Jewish coalition conversations, nor in the national debate, on TV, radio, or anything I read, that said, let's go gather up 12 million people and ship them out of America. It is really playing lowball to say that it's xenophobic for us to say, for example, we want you to come here legally through the front door and not sneak in through the back door. 10% of Mexico is now in the United States. That means there are issues. Mexico is not incentivized to grow its economy. It's bad for us. It's bad for Mexico. It's bad for trade. Mexico could become like Singapore if we could adopt different policies. Israel's allowed to have a security fence. We're allowed to have a security fence. There's terrorism in the world. Mexico, by the way, has a rigorous enforcement of its southern border. They just want to push people into the United States because they get the remittances back. We all understand the risks to human beings, the human rights catastrophe, the ransom that people are held for, the drug problem, the terrorism that can come in across the border. That's the issue of illegal immigration. It's not xenophobia, and I take offense to that. Number 2, on the intimidation of the Democrats, I saved for the end. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, would not co-sponsor the vote supporting Israel under assault from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon on Israel's northern border. 4,000 missiles rained down on northern Israel. A third of the country had to leave their homes and businesses. She would not co-sponsor the legislation. She voted for it. It passed 410 to 8 to support Israel under attack from Hezbollah. 7 Democrats, 1 Republican. But why wouldn't she co-sponsor it? Because she's intimidated by the left of her party. MoveOn.org, George Soros, the major funder of the Democratic Party, not a fan of Israel. You can Google his statements on Israel. So she would not step forward to side clearly, morally clearly, with Israel. And the last point is something that I care a lot about. You hinted at it a couple times. Sometimes I hear even worse statements, which is basically an attack on Christians in America and their support of the United States and, of course, their support of Israel. There are between 50 and 100 million Christian Zionists in the United States. They rejected replacement. They rejected replacement theology, that the Jews are not the inheritors of God's love and protection, but rather the church would be. It was the Nazis responsible for the Shoah, but how could it happen in Christendom? Only because the way it had been prepared to degrade and devalue the placement of Jews. But in the United States, we don't have that situation. Christians Conservative Christians, the churches that vote Republican, by the way, not the ones on the left that vote Democrat and call for divestment and boycott and sanction PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA, among others. Conservative Christians, Republican Christians throughout this country are extremely warm to Jews and to Israel, and I just think that ought to be acknowledged.
Last word goes to Andrew.
Okay, before I go into that, the immigration comments actually come from Tom Tancredo, who is a Republican candidate for president, and in opposing, and his position and many other Republicans have been that if you make it illegal, what will happen is that they'll just leave, or that they should all be basically some way they should be forced out of the country, either through economic pressure or otherwise. And all that's going to lead to, by the way, is an increase in crime. When you don't offer health care to people who can't pay for it, we eventually get sick from their germs. I would also point out, with regards to the discussion about, with regards to Pelosi, this is a perfect example of a mischaracterization. Pelosi was a sponsor, but she had asked that concern be put in for civilians on both sides of the conflict. The Republicans took the language out to try to politicize the issue, and that's why she withdrew her sponsorship but not her vote, because the Republicans would not keep their word as to the language in the legislation. Since 1948, the Democratic Party has stood by Israel in word and in action, expanding aid, not cutting it, taking on and not attaching conditions to the aid, taking on Iran and Syria and Saudi Arabia in a consistent fashion, instead of on one hand saying we're opposed to them but slipping the money under the table. It is the Democratic Party that has consistently stood up for the defense of Israel throughout that entire period, and have stood up for the freedoms in this country that you and I have stood up for. When someone says that we disagree with the decisions of evangelicals who try to forcibly proselytize Jews in the Air Force Academy, it doesn't mean it's anti-Christian. It means we ask them to treat us as Jews with the same religious respect that they want us to treat them with. And that is not disingenuous. And we should always accept the help of anyone who wants to support Israel, as long as they don't want to encourage Israel to be irresponsible to support another agenda other than what's best for Israel. And the Democratic Party has been the same way. And I think that whether we have a President Clinton, an Obama, or an Edwards, you will see a president who is consistent in standing up for the Jewish community and the concepts that we as Jews hold important. Supporting Israel, tikkun olam, and also trying to exemplify the changes that we want in the world by our own actions. Thank you.
That's an end for the session for today's session. I have this many cards. I only got to a small portion. I apologize. We'd be here for days if I had to go through all of them, and I suspect they'd keep coming endlessly. I did my best to get a cross-section. And again, thank both of these men. And I guess if you want to chat with them after informally, they're here.